And last but not least, I'm not doing my usual last segment, the state of the state.
State of the state.
But I do have some analysis. Typically, I end an episode with a segment called the state of the state, where I talk about any sort of political analysis I have more broadly. But today, I'm going to talk about the French Revolution? Question mark? The French Revolution? Progressive Charles Booker was very close to beating centrist Amy McGrath in the Democratic Kentucky primary. At the time of this recording, it still hasn't been decided yet who won, but by the time I release this, it may have been. But Charles Booker was looking pretty close to winning last I saw. It seems very possible, maybe likely. Meanwhile, progressive Jamal Bowman primaried the centrist Israel defender Elliot Engel in a similar way that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez primaried Joe Crowley. In response to this, that old spinster himself, Lindsey Graham, tweeted, quote, "It appears the French Revolution..." Let me try to do a Lindsey Graham impression. Quote, "It appears the French Revolution has now come to the Democratic Party base on initial primary results from New York and Kentucky. If you had any doubts about who's in charge of the Democratic Party, all doubts should have been removed." So, let's talk a little bit about the French Revolution. My Lindsey Graham impression was basically my Al Gore impression. An inconvenient truth. But okay, about the French Revolution. This is some reactionary shit, man, in the most traditional use of the word. So, what is the French Revolution? It signifies the transition from a feudal economy, a feudal political economic system, to a capitalist one. Now, when the French Revolution happened, it's not like France immediately became capitalistic. Rather, it was more of a political revolution that became a lot more democratic, not hereditary, anything like that. And that happened at a time when the material conditions were inching towards capitalism anyway. Industrialization maybe hadn't really started yet, but was in its infancy. But things like mercantilism was becoming a thing. There was also an artisan class that was growing as the working class urbanized. So by that I mean, when there's a agrarian society, it becomes a lot easier to organize labor in a feudal way. You divide things up by land and give that land to different people to control. When a workforce urbanizes, it becomes a lot harder to use feudalism because you don't really depend on land as much as you do with an agrarian system. So, as the urban proletariat developed, they began working for monetary compensation rather than the traditional agrarian way where the peasants would grow the grain and then a lord would expropriate most of the grain, leave enough for them to eat, maybe give them some like coins or some stuff. That's the feudal way. Now, in the urban proletariat way, they got paid a wage, a money wage by the hour. All of that is to say that the French Revolution was a necessity for the contemporary nation state to develop. And consequently, the conventional current contemporary modern nation state was necessary for capitalism to reach its full form. One thing people don't always talk about when they talk about Napoleon is... let me back up. So, there was the French Revolution. abolish the ancient regime. Then there was the Thermidorean reaction, which were basically part of the new dominant bourgeoisie who clamped down on the left wing of the revolution. In other words, both the proletariat, the working class, or what predated it at least, and the bourgeoisie were both underclasses before the French Revolution. The dominant classes were things like, I don't know the actual titles in France, but, lords and vassals. Those are the dominant classes in ancient regimes. The bourgeoisie, the urban employers, had power over their employees, but they were not the dominant class. So then the French Revolution happens, and both the workers and the bourgeoisie gain power. There's a hardcore left-wing turn. There's purges, purging the ancient regime, French Revolution style. Then there's the Thermidorean reaction, where the bourgeois actually seize power from the just general working class and institute a class society that works for their needs. It became a society where the dominant class were the employers, when in the chaos of the French Revolution, there kind of was no longer class, or class had no longer been reoriented and reestablished. Then Napoleon comes along, and he spreads the idea of the nation state throughout Europe. Before that, the state wasn't organized in the way it currently is. And that was almost like the germ of capitalism to come, disseminating throughout Europe. So my point is, this demonization of the French Revolution by someone like Lindsey Graham says a lot more than it does. You might think it just means, oh, they're anti-chaos. But then he could have used any example besides the French Revolution. Why did he say the French Revolution? Because he's saying, this is how I interpret it. He may have never intended this, but I'm doing close reading of what he says, folks. He referred to the French Revolution because he recognizes this isn't really a communist revolution. The infrastructure is not there for anything like that to happen. So it is a capitalist revolution, but it's done by the left-wing element of a capitalist revolution. The French left. And Lindsey Graham wants to stay firmly on the side of the reactionaries. This is where the term reactionary comes from, the Thermidorean reaction, where the right wing of the revolution clamped down on the left and seized power, formed the power structure after them. He sees himself and the Republican Party as the Thermidorean reaction to these current protests. I will say, maybe I did go too off into the weeds of close reading what he meant by this tweet. Maybe he's just an idiot and it's like, it's scary. This cannot stand. These masked people are scaring me. This is chaos, like the French Revolution. But, I mean, he put it out there. I'm just close reading it, whether he intended it or not. People's words mean things, and I think there is a reason why he settled on the French Revolution.